We have the prayer on the Mount of Olives, sometimes called the agony in the garden, but there's no garden in Luke. And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done." Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to his disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, "Why do you all sleep? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation." Prayer is a Lucan theme. Luke mentions prayer more than any other gospel. I'm guessing more than all the other gospels put together, but I haven't checked on that. Luke portrays Jesus praying more than any other gospel, one of his favorite themes. And the command to pray thus forms a frame for this scene. It's near the beginning of the scene, and it's the last part of the scene. So this major Lucan idea frames this scene. Luke has made some important omissions from Mark's story. Mark, most scholars think, wrote about 70. About 10 or 15 years later, Luke said, "That's pretty good, but I think I can do better." So he took Mark and improved on it. He did some improvement by adding, but he also left out stuff. Mark reports that Jesus was greatly distressed and troubled. Luke omits these emotions. Why? Luke is writing for Gentiles. Gentile philosophy is suspicious of human emotions. When humans get emotional, then we do crazy things. They call the emotions our passion. We get angry or lustful. So these emotions make humans do crazy things. And in the Gentile world, the philosopher who controlled his emotions was highly respected. Therefore, Luke systematically tones down the emotions of Jesus throughout his gospel, not just here in the Passion narrative. It's a trait of Luke. "Remove this cup from me." In Mark, Jesus says this emotional prayer 3 times. In Luke, he says it only once, part of the toning down process. Jesus is closer to the disciples. In Mark, Jesus first removes himself, along with Peter, James, and John, about a stone's throw from the other disciples. Then he leaves Peter, James, and John there and goes apart from them. So he's once removed from Peter, James, and John, and twice removed from the other body of disciples. In Luke, this first removal is omitted, so that Jesus is one stone's throw away from all of the disciples. As predicted at the Last Supper, the disciples are those who remain with Jesus, who are close to Jesus in his trials. He gives the guys a break. In Mark's story, the disciples are commanded to stay awake. There is no command in Luke. The Lucan disciples are weak. They can't stay awake, but they're not disobedient. They have not been commanded to stay awake. In Mark's story, the disciples fall asleep 3 times. In Luke, they fall asleep only once. And in Luke, they are sleeping for sorrow. Actually, when I'm doing serious mourning, sometimes I will walk miles and miles and miles late at night. I can't sleep, so I don't relate to sleeping for sorrow, but maybe some people mourn that way. The reproachful question of the Mark and Jesus, could you not watch 1 hour It's omitted. The proverb of the Mark and Jesus, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, is not applied to the Lucan disciples. Is Luke giving the guys a break or what? Then we have the angelic comforter. In verses 43 and 44, they appear in some manuscripts, but not in others. The Revised Standard Version omits them. The New Revised and the New American add them. Two of the greatest Catholic scholars of the 20th century had different opinions about these verses. Joseph Fitzmyer, who directed my dissertation, and of whom I have the greatest respect, thought that they were written by a scribe, not by Luke. Raymond Brown, I have more books by him than any other biblical scholar. He thought that they were written by Luke, not by a scribe. Then we have the story of the agony, hence we get the agony in the garden, where his sweat falls like drops of blood. Many imagine that Luke portrays Jesus as actually sweating blood. And one of our local physicians, many of you knew Dr. Holobeck, wrote an article with examples from history documented by physicians of people who sweat blood. And one account, one British physician reported the case of a British sailor who was about to be whipped. As punishment, the sailor was so frightened that he started bleeding even before the first lash was laid on him. In view of Luke's tendency to suppress the emotions of Jesus, how could Luke have written this? This is one of Fitzmyer's arguments that the line was added by a scribe, not written by Luke. But Brown says, if you interpret it differently, he points out that Luke states only that his sweat was like drops of blood. That is, Jesus was sweating profusely, sweat pouring down like blood pours from fresh cuts. The word agon in Greek literally means athletic contest. And the Greek agonia, it's an abstract noun, it means readiness for the athletic contest. So the image is that of a boxer who, when he takes his robe off, when he gets in the ring, he's already glistening with sweat. He's ready for the fight. So Brown's summary, all the drama in this scene is centered in Luke's unique portrayal of Jesus. Each one of the Passion narratives is unique. That's why we read all four, not just one of them. My purpose in doing this is help us to understand the uniqueness of Luke. His unique portrayal of Jesus. He is not one whose soul is sorrowful unto death, as in Mark, or who lies prostrate in the dust, as in Mark. He has prayed often during his ministry, so now on his knees he utters a prayer to his Father, prefaced and concluded by subordination of his will to God's will. The Son's prayer does not remain unanswered. Rather, God sends an angel to strengthen him. The divine assistance brings Jesus to agonia, whence the agony in the garden, a Greek term which does not refer to agony in the ordinary sense, but describes the supreme tension of the athlete, covered with sweat at the start of a contest. In that spirit, Jesus rises from his prayer ready to enter the trial, even as he mercifully tells his disciples to pray that they be spared from that trial. Then the betrayal and arrest. While he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And when those who were about him saw what would follow, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, Have you come out against me as a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. So then the kiss of Judas to identify Jesus. We will see there's no need for this in John. When the arresting party arrives in John, Jesus steps forward and identifies himself. In Mark, followed by Matthew, Judas plants an identifying kiss on Jesus. In Luke, the kiss is never planted. Evidently, Luke considered a kiss from Judas too disgusting to write about. He approaches him, but he never plants the kiss. Swordplay. All of the Gospels portray swordplay at the arrest. The Greek is ambiguous as to what is cut off. It can be translated as ear or earlobe. And who did the whacking? It depends on what gospel you read. In Mark, it's an anonymous bystander who does the whacking, which is why Jesus makes no response in Mark. It wasn't one of his guys, so he doesn't need to respond. In Luke, it is one of them, one of the disciples of Jesus, using a sword that we've already heard about, hence the response of Jesus. He needs to respond. One of his guys is getting out of hand. Most people remember that Simon Peter did the whacking. Most people don't realize that this is only in John's version of the story. We'll do more on this when we do John. So we have a healing in Gethsemane. He touches the ear or the earlobe. As the story ends in John, Mark, and Matthew, the poor devil is still bleeding. Only in Luke is he healed. And this is part of the Lucan theme of Jesus healing even during the Passion narrative. And Luke omits the final line from Mark in the arrest scene, and they all ran away. Unlike the Markan and Matthean disciples, the Lucan disciples do not run away. As predicted by Jesus at the Last Supper, they are those who remain close to him in his trials. Unlike the Matthean and Markan disciples, they will be present at the crucifixion. Peter's denial of Jesus. Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. Peter followed at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. Then a maid, seeing him as he sat in the light and gazing at him, said, "This man was also with him." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And a little later, someone else saw him and said, "You are also one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, "Certainly this man also was with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are saying." And immediately, while he was speaking, the cock crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. The story is in all the Gospels, and who asks the question is different in different Gospels, but there are 3 questions, there are 3 denials. Luke, he leaves out that the last time Peter started cursing and swearing. And that can be interpreted to say that he was cursing Jesus. It could be he's invoking a curse on himself. I'll be damned if I know him. But he could also say, I'll prove I'm not a disciple, and curse Jesus right there. So Luke just omits that. That's also part of giving the guys a break. And let's see. There was something else, but it's gone. The mocking and beating of Jesus. Now, the men who were holding Jesus mocked him and beat him. They also blindfolded him and asked him, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" And they spoke many other words against him, reviling him. Luke places this before Jesus is interviewed by the council. In Mark and Matthew, it comes after it, so that the ones beating and mocking Jesus and spitting on him are not the soldiers, as here in Luke, but they are the members of the council. And I once said to someone that Luke is probably more realistic. We all know that sometimes soldiers and police get out of hands and rough up a prisoner. I said, but the guys in this council, they're like bishops. They might be angry at some theologian charged with heresy, but they wouldn't strike him or spit at him. And the other guy, I said, well, you don't know some of the bishops I know. Anyway, ironically, the guards are not aware that the prophecies of Jesus, like Peter will deny him 3 times, the prophecies are coming true, even as they're mocking him for not being able to prophesy. Then Jesus before the council, when day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council, and they said, if you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. And they all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said to them, you say that I am. And they said, what further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips. Now, the Son of Man, remember I commented on that in Daniel 7. He's the one who's going to judge the world in God's name. So this doesn't mean lowly human nature when he talks about the Son of Man. Son of God, this does not mean that they are accusing Jesus of claiming that he has divine nature. Son of God was a messianic title. Every king from David on the day of his enthronement, heard Psalm 2. You are my son. This day I have begotten you. So the elevation to the throne as king over Israel, as the anointed Messiah king, that was considered what made the king son of God in a special way that other Israelites were not. And so when they're asking him if he's claiming to be son of God, it's not about divine nature. It's about, are you the expected Davidic king? Let's see. Then he's brought before Pilate. Hey, I just finished chapter 22. We'll stop right here.